Hello, welcome along to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. This is the podcast that takes a look inside an author's working day. This week, we are with the award-winning million-copy bestseller, Katherine Gray.
I think I have quite a cinematic imagination, at the risk of sounding pretentious. So it's already there. I've got it with me. I don't need, to have that sort of board of things to look at. I didn't know that you had to put a part of yourself into every character in order to breathe life into the characters. And with non-fiction, I think you can get away with being a bit more effusive. And with fiction, I think it has to be a lot more spare and laconic. I mean, I think it's something that a lot of people do have in their heads, is it making them better and looser and faster and somehow more. But I think it's a myth, and it's almost impossible to find out either way, because some of the writers that did drink heavily while working, we can't see what their work would have been like if they hadn't. It might have been even better.
So my name is Dan Simpson. This is the podcast where we uncover all the secrets that help a writer get their book published. This week we are with Katherine Gray, award-winning journalist. She's been published in Grazia and The Guardian and The Telegraph and so many more places. She's published non-fiction. Her runaway success, really, is The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober. It's sold over 1 million copies. It's been translated into 9 languages. And after 4 non-fiction books, she's now published her first novel. It's called Versions of a Girl. It's a sliding doors novel about nature versus nurture. And you can hear how it was written. We chat about avoiding stereotypes, about training yourself to get to work without any fuss, without any faff. You can just get down to it. And there is a dog in this video. Now, if you like hearing about the writing routines of the best authors around, Karen Slaughter, Sir Ian Rankin, Matt Haig, then make sure you follow my Writer's Routine podcast. You can take a listen wherever you get your shows. We're everywhere. And subscribe to this channel where new episodes are popping up all of the time. And let's get down to it then. We start every podcast in exactly the same way. This week with Katherine Gray, finding out what she sees around her in the place where she sits down to write.
Okay, what I see around me, this is my study, but I do as little work here as possible. It's an absolute mess. It's the kind of dumping ground where we put things if they need to go in the loft or the garage. And in my house, it's a very small house. I have a toddler, she's 2. And when I try and work here, she stands at the bottom of the stairs and shouts for me. And my dog, who's very high maintenance, he either wants to be in the room or out of the room or go outside or alert me that a squirrel has done something 3 streets over. So I do as little work here as possible. I tend to go to co-working spaces, not cafes, but I also there's a lounge in my gym that's very tranquil, and I use that as well. But co-working spaces are my happy place when it comes to writing.
Why co-working spaces? Why not your bog standard cafe or spending more time in your gym? What is the co-working space bringing to you?
Well, in a co-working space, you generally have a quiet room where people are supposed to turn their notifications off. Notifications on can send me into a murderous rage because I have my noise cancelling headphones on. I am facing a wall. I cannot have anything around me that is distracting. In the ideal scenario, I cannot see anyone. I cannot hear anything. And it's just me and my computer. So I can't do cafe culture. It just doesn't work for me at all. So that's why I have to pay for a co-working space most of the time.
Is there something a bit impersonal about a co-working space? I mean, I've chatted to so many authors doing this, and you might have heard some, and they like the idea of curating their writing space so they can have the pictures and the colours and the post-it notes, whereas in a co-working space, well, by its nature, it's shared, right? So How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, in an ideal world, I on my vision board somewhere, there is a gorgeous colour coordinated library that I work in from home where nobody disturbs me, and I have a lovely armchair to read in and a reading light from the 1930s, whatever. But that is not the reality. And as I say, if I work from here, it's just my dog or my toddler just constantly trying to get to me. So if I could afford maybe an office elsewhere and make that very personal, I would love to do that. but that's not my situation. So I just got to make do.
So what do you take with you then when you're heading to your co-working space? What have you got in the rucksack or whatever it is?
I generally have a flask of mint tea because I can't work without it. I have my noise cancelling headphones. They're an absolute must. I have my laptop, my separate keyboard, and my mouse and my little stand to make it as ergonomic as possible. But then I counter that by sitting on a really comfy chair, usually that's not at all back friendly. But yeah, that I have my rucksack set up and ready to go.
So it's quite minimalist then in what you're taking with you.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I do is I will turn my Wi-Fi off. I will just be with the writing. When I'm writing, I need to just be doing that. And if I need to look anything up or research anything, I mean, this doesn't really apply with nonfiction, but with fiction, I just make a note of it and research great blue herons or aircrafts later on. I just need to be just me and Microsoft Word. So it's actually a plus if the Wi-Fi in the gym is wonky and it isn't working. That actually works better for me because it means that I can go into a flow and really get into it.
So I know that you have listened to the show and that you've kind of taken inspiration or the reverse of that. What's the reverse of inspiration? I don't know. You've taken the opposite of that from other writers, maybe ones that are like very busy and surround themselves with a lot of clutter. What do you kind of make of writers who do it that way?
I think whatever works, and going back to me being inspired by the show, I'm going to say I'm a super fan. You've done like 330 episodes or something. I must have listened to 200 of them. And the number one thing that I tell people if they are struggling to find motivation to write is I tell them to listen to your show, because there's something about listening to other writers and how they do it that makes me... I used to listen to it when I was walking to my co-working space. And once I got there, I was like, let me at the computer. I can't wait to write like Maggie O'Farrell does. So yeah, I cannot express enough. It's the podcast that I've listened to the most, but I don't judge other writers however they do it. We all get there in the end, and it doesn't matter how you go about it.
Maybe it's not a case of judgment then. Maybe it's a case of not even not even being inspired by it. It's just being very conscious of how you're doing things. So we'll move into the routine in just a second, but like, how much thought have you given to like how you work best, what time of day you work best, what you need around you? You've mentioned the noise cancelling headphones. You've mentioned wanting to murder people about notifications. So there's clearly quite a lot of consideration there. Yeah,
and I mean, I'm thinking about this now because I know that other writers will do things like pin up pictures of a setting and pictures of people that look like their characters, how they see their characters in their heads. And I guess the best way to explain it is that I already have it all in my head, so I don't need any sort of visual aids to see, Ireland or California or whatever setting I'm writing about. I think I have quite a cinematic imagination, at the risk of sounding pretentious. So it's already there. I've got it with me. I don't need, to have that sort of board of things to look at, if that explains it.
No, I think it does perfectly. And you'll know that we get like a little bit niche and nerdy. So if all you are taking with you, if all you are working with really is your laptop, what are you doing on that? Like, what's the writing software? What's your font preference?
Well, I am a devotee of Word. I love Word. I don't like working in anything else. I'm very simple. I just like a bit of Arial, clean, simple. I don't mess about. I used to use Times New Roman, but that I somehow associate that with working full-time for magazines, so I'm a little bit traumatised by that. Don't use that anymore. So as an author, I moved over to Arial. That sort of expressed my independence. And I have used Final Draft when I wrote a screenplay. That was very helpful. But in general, I just keep it simple.
Well, you mentioned like being a journalist and writing for different magazines and different publications. I wonder if that leads into how like basic your writing setup needs to be, that you don't need any of the fuss and the pageantry of the perfect writing chair and a cup of tea at this. Well, you got your mint tea, but you know what I mean. Like you don't. It seems a lot more clinical than other writers that I've spoken to. I don't know, how much do you think that could be the case, that kind of writing for so long before getting a novel down made you do it in the most simplest way?
I think that's true, and I've never even really considered that. But as a journalist, you have to write on demand. I've had jobs where I had to kick out 3 articles a day of 700 to 800 words each. So you just have to get on with it, and you can't be messing about. And often in offices, you're hot desking, so you just have to be able to get into the zone. And so because of that, I've never struggled with writer's block either. And I don't have a particular time of day. I know writers that get up at 4 a.m. to work, and they really feel like they do their best work then. I can work at any time. I feel like I'm very flexible that way. But I've been doing this for a long time, since I was 24, and I'm now 44. So it's a job for me, and it always has been ever since I left university, pretty much.
I know that one of the things that really kind of launched your name was kind of the unexpected joy of being sober, right? And you've been sober for many, many years. This is the obvious question, but how much do you think that is relevant to your ability to work at any time? I don't know, is it doing something for your energy? Is it doing something for your whole outlook on the day, and that it comes from a more complete, well-rounded, healthier, more wellness-focused way of working?
Well, I think, I think a lot of creative people would associate alcohol with creativity, and they might have a drink while they're working. And because I never did that when I was a journalist, because I was working during the day, I don't associate it in any way with creativity. So, and yeah, it does mean that if I need to get up at 6 a.m. and work, I can do that and I feel fresh. And it also means that if I'm working till 1, which does happen when I'm on a deadline, that I'm not drunk. So that helps.
I know you are. Well, I know that you're an ambassador for alcohol change, and I know you've already said that you're a big advocate for whatever works for you, right? For writers. But is it something that you would recommend to people, I would say, just as particularly writers, maybe if they do need to work at odd times, if they are looking for that boost of energy that comes from somewhere, is that something that you would really attest to?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm 10 years sober, so I obviously really like it. And, you know, the way that I structure my day, I go for a 5-kilometre run in the morning. And in many ways, that replaces what alcohol gave me. It gets me into the zone. It gets me relaxed. It gets me into a meditative state, I guess. It quietens down my very, very busy mind. So I would say if you need to, you know, if you've got a very busy 3-month period where you need to kick out a final draft, it's not going to hinder things if you go sober for those 3 months. It's only going to help them, I would imagine, unless you see alcohol and creativity as a horse and carriage, then that might be a problem. But yeah, I would recommend it.
How much of a problem do you think the link between kind of booze and creativity is? Because we do, especially with writers, right? We idealize, you know, Hemingway and these authors that back in the day would sit there and just like smash down whiskey when they were writing. And I don't know if it had ended well, but is that how healthy can that be for the culture of writing?
I mean, I think it's something that a lot of people do have in their heads, is it making them better and looser and faster and somehow more. But I think it's a myth, and it's almost impossible to find out either way, because some of the writers that did drink heavily while working, we can't see what their work would have been like if they hadn't. It might have been even better. So yeah, I have heard from a lot of people who do find that they're blocked when they quit drinking. And as I say, I've never experienced that, but I think it's just something you've just got to show up at the page and treat it like a job, because it is, if you're an author, it is your job to write. And that's what you've got to do. And even if you can't write that day and you're editing or reading, I also build reading into my working day. So I have an hour at the end of the day where I read, and I treat that as work because I'm a very active reader. I'll be constantly making notes in the column, and one word or one phrase can spiral off into me writing a whole paragraph of my own work in the column of somebody else's book. So that's a good point, actually. I would say if you are stuck and you are blocked, read as much as you possibly can.
Well, let's get into the day then, Katherine. The show is writer's routine, so talk us through yours. The moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. On a day when you are writing, how does the whole thing look? Like, leave no stone unturned. When does it all begin?
Okay, so I wake up at 7:30. That's when my toddler wakes up too. She's a very reasonable toddler. And I have a coffee, can't do anything without a coffee. Then I go for a 5-kilometre run with my dog. As I say, can't function without that. That just sort of declutters my mind somehow. And if I've got a full working day, which is only 3.5 days a week at the minute because of childcare situation, I will either go to a co-working space or I'll go to my gym. And if I'm writing at that time, I will clear out a 4-hour window to really get into it. I can't do this thing that other people do where they snatch little bits of time here and there. I need a big, long runway of time in order to get into it. So that's really important for me. And generally, if I'm at the gym, I will end the working day by reading and then also going for a swim and a sauna. So it's not a bad life, Dan. It really isn't. But also, so much of being a writer comes with other tasks. Like I have to write articles for magazines. I have to do loads of press. So a lot of my day will be taken up with things like emails and stuff like that. So finding those 4 hours uninterrupted is actually quite tricky. And when I am on a deadline, I have to warn all my friends and family. I might be incommunicado for a while because I'm going to have to prioritise this.
How have you settled on 4 hours?
I don't know, just through trial and error. I mean, I've written 5 books now, and I've discovered that if I only have 2 hours, I feel rushed and it doesn't work. I need the luxury of that time. I don't know why it is. And I have noticed that whenever I have that 4 hours, if I can get into a flow state, I can write, and then look up and I've written for 2 hours and I haven't even looked at the clock. So I think I need a bit of time to settle into that. And that's why I need the lack of distractions around me in order to get into that sort of state.
I'm very jealous of the gym thing, by the way. There's a really nice gym down the road from me that I can't afford. But just to be someone that can spend all day there is something I've always dreamed of. It probably sounds preposterous, doesn't it? That's a dream, that you want to spend all day at the gym.
You're hardly thinking at the actual gym, just to be clear. Do about 20 squats and then I'm like, all right, I'm done. Just going to sit on my ass for the rest of the time and eat this cake and drink this tea and write.
Is there an aim for the 4 hours? Like, are you hoping to get to a certain word count? What are you working to?
No, I mean, I am quite a prolific writer. When I am on a deadline, I can do about 5,000 words a week, sometimes more. Some days I'll create 3,000 if I'm really, really there. But so much of it is rewriting and editing, and it really is the case. Sorry, that's my dog trying to get on my lap. It really is the case that once a book goes to press, I have edited it literally hundreds of times. I mean, I will often start those 4 hours by reading through what I've done the day before and editing it. And so that is, so much of the process. I don't believe that things are ever perfect and you should leave them untouched. I think it can always be improved, much to the consternation of my team sometimes, because I'm trying to change things just before they go to print. but I'm a lifelong student when it comes to learning about writing and getting better at it. And I think that's the attitude that you should have. You know, you never know it all, and you can always learn more, which is why I love listening to your podcast and watching masterclasses about writing and just finding out how other people do it and picking out tips.
I want to get to what you've learned in just a second, but you mentioned your kind of experience and career as being a journalist means perhaps you're more set up to just kind of get on with it. So when you first get to wherever it is, the co-working space or the gym, are you pretty good at laptop open and we're cracking? I don't need any fuss. Nothing gets in the way. I can immediately get into the headspace.
Well, you see, I have an issue where whenever I join a co-working space, then I get to know people and I end up procrastinating by chatting to people for at least an hour before I get down to work. So it does mean that I've had to move co-working spaces a few times in order to have a co-working space where I don't know anyone, because otherwise it can get to the point where I can easily kill an hour and a half just by chattering away by the kettle to people. So no is the answer to that. I'm not like a writing robot. I don't go to the co-working space and open my laptop and here I go. I'm always getting in my own way, which is why I have to have all these things. Like I will literally delete Instagram when I'm on a deadline. I won't have any social media on my phone. And yeah, as I say, I'll disable my Wi-Fi. It's a plus if I can't access the Wi-Fi. I need to get myself into that space where there's nothing around me that can get in the way, because I am so good at latching onto it and going for a procrastination ride. So, yeah.
When you call time on your 4 hours of work, when you're back home and you've got, well, the dog and you've got the toddler, how good are you at switching off, at parking everything at the back? You're not thinking of it again that day?
Very bad. So the best way to describe it is that, do you remember in the early noughties when you downloaded a film and it took all night? So it's like that, except 2 months before I start writing, that is going on in my head the entire time. It's like an open tab. It's like something downloading constantly. So I will stop in the middle of runs. I won't wake up in the middle of the night because I'm always tired because I've got a toddler, but I used to, and I have this running notes document that I'm always adding things to. I'm constantly thinking about what I'm writing, even when I'm not thinking about writing, if that makes sense. And that's how I do it. So the start of any book will be lots and lots of scrappy notes that I've made on my phone, a lot of which just make no sense. Some of which I'm like, yeah, that's really good. And then I hit Word and actually start, but it has to be going on like that for a couple of months so that I don't start with nothing. So I never switch off, really. I'm always thinking about it, even when I'm not thinking about it.
You mentioned you've got 5 books out now, and as we've said, you are someone that listens to the show, so you're someone who is interested in the process, constantly trying to improve. What else have you? So you've learned that 4 hours is your optimum amount of time to spend working. What else have you learned about how you work best through the last 5 novels? What have you tried out? What have you failed with? How have you come to this point that you're set on how you write?
Well, okay. So in terms of tools which have helped me, I think, become a better writer. I've only written 1 novel, by the way, so the rest are non-fiction. And I would say, so Stephen King's On Writing is the Bible, and I know lots of writers say that, but it really is. And I couldn't actually find much else about writing novels that was very helpful, apart from a book by Dorothea Brand, which she wrote in the 1920s, which was kind of like a very stern school mum giving you philosophical lessons, but I really enjoyed it. There were some real gems in there. I think that helped me become a better writer. And yeah, so other than that, I think books about screenplays have helped me the most. So Story by Robert McKee is an absolute, it's a must read in my opinion. And I really like all the masterclasses with a lot of the screenplay writers like Shonda Rhimes and Aaron Sorkin. They're really worth a look. So I think that's how I've learned to write a novel, but it really did involve me going back to school, because the first draft I wrote wasn't very good. I didn't nail it. And when I realised that, I really had to think, okay, I need to go away and learn about this. You can't just make stuff up and make characters up. You have to study the craft and find out how to do this. So I completely rewrote it. And I would say the actual novel is probably only 10% of the first draft, because I had to, completely start from scratch, rip it all up, start again.
What was wrong with it?
Well, okay, I made the mistake of thinking that how do I put this? I didn't know that you had to put a part of yourself into every character in order to breathe life into the characters. And with nonfiction, I think you can get away with being a bit more effusive. And with fiction, I think it has to be a lot more spare and laconic. I think that's the key difference between them. So I was writing fiction as if I was writing nonfiction, and it just didn't quite work. And it was only once I stripped that back and found out from other people how they do it and really looked at the structure that it started to work. But it took a good 4 drafts. And as I say, I lost most of my first words.
When you've learned those things, because you've been paying attention to masterclasses and you've understood that maybe you shouldn't write fiction as if it were non-fiction, how are you consciously making the decisions of what to change? Every sentence that you write, every paragraph that you write, are you thinking, oh, okay, I need to do it like this. I need to breathe this into my character. They need to be doing this. And if you are doing that, how can that not take away some of the, I guess, how natural prose can feel?
I think that's a really good question. I think the best way to describe it, sorry. So you must have heard the phrase many times about murdering your darlings.
Yes.
Okay. So this is something that I really had a problem with in my first draft. I would latch onto a metaphor and take it too far. Or I would find a simile that I really like and take it too far. And it almost became a little bit purple, which I'm sure you've heard before. It just means a little bit flowery. And so in order for it to work, I had to kill a lot of those darlings. And I had to cut some of those descriptive paragraphs, say, for instance, down to 1 line in order for it to work. But the other thing was, so there were some characters. There's one character, the mother in the novel, she's a narcissist. And in the first draft, she was quite 3D. She was very unlikable. And in order for her to come to life and become a more rounded character, I had to put a lot of myself into her. So my darkest thoughts about being a mother myself. So that's something that's really true. And I've heard other novelists say that before, and I thought, I'm sure that that's not the case. You don't always have to put a facet of your personality into a character. But I do think that is the case now.
How tricky was it to be that critical of yourself? I don't think I could do it. I think if I ever managed to get a full draft out, I would think it was the best thing going. There's no way I could read through it and think, oh, I'm being too flowery here. There's not enough of myself here. There is simply no way I could be that logically critical. How did you manage to do that about yourself?
Well, it's something that is, whenever you're a journalist, that you have to lose that fear of feedback, and you have to self-edit it if you're going to survive, because journalism is quite cutthroat. I've had some experiences where I've filed features and it's come back with like lines through most of it, and criticism all over it. So you learn to take that even from yourself. And you have to do it yourself, because you can't, as a professional journalist, turn in pieces that are meant to be 1,200 words that are 3,000 words long. So you have to learn to identify your best work. But the other thing is, just because of a turn of circumstances, I had an inbuilt delay. My original publisher was taken over by Headline. And so as a result of that, I was able to have 6 months between writing the first draft and then starting on the second draft. So I do think when you have that time delay, you see your own work a lot more clearly. I know that Stephen King says, throw it in a drawer for 6 months. And that's what happened to me as a result of natural circumstance. And as a result, I think it was much better. And your instincts, the longer you're a writer, the more your instincts kick in, and you know when something's good or when it's not. And that's something that can't be taught. It just comes with time. And I don't see it as being critical of myself. I just see it as growing, and growing is painful. And that's okay.
So that's a few of the things that, well, some of the benefits you've had from writing, well, being a journalist, and some of the benefits and the pros and cons of being a non-fiction author. How else did it set you up for having a good stab at being a novelist, writing 4 non-fiction books? What translated well to fiction?
In terms of being a journalist, not very much, because I mean, all of the skills that I used as a non-fiction author were transferable from journalism, like things like finding and interviewing case studies, interviewing experts, doing lots of research, learning to find out what's a reliable source and what isn't. But as I say, when I came to write the novel, I hadn't got a clue. And I really had to, it's a completely different discipline. And I think you have to relearn how to write. And it couldn't be more different in my view. And I actually think it's harder, because you have to create a convincing world and convincing people that are not true. Otherwise, you get into legal bother. So, you know, with nonfiction, you just write what happened. I've written a lot about my own life. You write what happened. That's literally it. Or you go away and research it, and you say, this is what all the research says, and this is what I believe to be true. This is my opinion, but here's what else is out there. And so it couldn't be more different. And I was humbled by the process. I really was, but in a good way. And now I love it so much. I can't wait to do my second. I've got a deal for a second, and I already know what it's going to be, and I've pitched it and they like it. So I can't wait to get stuck in.
Let me just dive back to the day. You mentioned you set aside an hour, like block in an hour to read. Which is quite a random but like brilliantly focused way of doing it. So at what point did you decide to make that decision that, well, I need to read and learn, and I'm going to block out proper working time where I could be doing anything else to do that? Well,
it's mostly circumstance. So for me, I can't believe how much time I used to have as a non-parent. And I easily had sort of 3 hours of leisure time after dinner each evening to watch TV and read. So that hour, and often more, just came along at the end of the day when I was going to bed. And now that doesn't happen. I mean, sometimes it takes until 11 to get my toddler down. So I have to build it into my working day, because I found that for the first year of parenthood, I read about 2 books, and actually I didn't even read them. I just listened to them on audio. So you have to find a way to do it, because I think if you're a writer and you're not reading, then that's quite a dangerous thing. You should have your eyes open as to what your peers are doing. I read at least a book a week, if not 2. And I think that's a crucial part of the process.
Are you consciously reading quite widely then?
Yeah, I naturally read quite widely, although I say that and I don't like historical fiction or fantasy. So, I mean, I read what I like. I read a lot of non-fiction and a lot of fiction, but I know what I like, and that tends to be sort of contemporary book club fiction. I'm sure you've heard that term. It's sort of that sweet spot between commercial and literary, where there's a propulsive plot, but it's very character driven as well. And that's what I love. Like, I love a bit of Celeste Ng and Coco Mellors and Kylie Reid, and I've recently discovered Erin Kelly. She's incredible, but that's more crime. So I know what I like, but when it comes to nonfiction, I'm a much more I really read a wide range.
Well, so your debut novel, Versions of a Girl, is out. Just tell us, Katherine, about the very first moment that the idea for that story came into your head.
Well, the first scene, which is no longer the first scene, actually, there's a prologue before it, but there's a scene where the main character, Fern, she's 14 and she accidentally steals a car. That arrived almost fully formed in my mind. And then the rest of it sort of unfolded. It wasn't really a conscious process, although I am a plotter. I do allow myself to be a pantser as I'm going through. So I have a board. It's right. You might be able to see the corner of it here.
Yeah,
it's
I can see the
4 feet
corner.
by 2 feet. And when I was plotting this out, it was absolutely covered in those little index cards. And there was even a bit of colour coding, Dan. I love that stationery, as many writers do. And yeah, so it I don't know how to describe it. It just sort of unfolded in my head, but I had to, in order to keep a hold of the plot, I had to plot tightly and know exactly what scene was going to come next. But then I did adapt it as it went through. So let me tell you what it's about. It's we open on Fern. She's 14. She has spent equal years with her parents who are divorced. Her parents are very, very different. Her father is an absolute hellraiser. He lives hand to mouth in Californian motels. He cannot be trusted with fire, breakables, or feelings. Her mother is an ex-ballerina. She lives this plush life in a London townhouse. And her biggest concern is what other people think. And so this unexpected visitor comes along, throws Fern a dilemma. And then at this point, the storyline splits, sliding doors style. And as a result of this decision that Fern makes, one version of her is raised mainly by her father and the other by her mother. So it's looking at that whole nature versus nurture debate. But because of this, because of the dual timelines and the two different worlds, where the same set of characters and the same main character were doing very different things, I had to really keep close rein in order to get it to work. But so that's why I had to plot so tightly. I don't think I will with my next novel.
Let me drag you all the way back. So still, we've not really got there. So you mentioned that we open with Fern accidentally stealing a car. But that seems, apart from the fact that she's it's Hellraiser, so clearly that's kind of from her father's side of things, if you're looking at nature versus nurture. But like, how does that come into your head? Like, when was the first moment that you thought, oh, I want to explore the idea of this sliding doors focused on one girl and their upbringing?
I think the reason it came into my head, I was pregnant when I wrote the first draft, and I literally pressed send on it when I was in early labour, which is a bizarre metaphor. And I was very interested in, because I came to motherhood later in life. I was 42 when I had my toddler, and I was very, very interested in the psychology of how our character develops and how a different home life or a different dominant parent can shape us, and also how we can break free of that, because a lot of people do break free of that later in life. So because I was reading about all of the psychology around that, I think it must have informed my storyline. And there's quite a lot of myself in Fern, which I think a lot of debut novelists would say, if they're being honest. A lot of people write what they know, although she is not me. And when I was a teenager, I stole rather a lot of things, although never a car. So I think it just came about as a result of all of that going on in my head, being pregnant. Throughout my 30s, I didn't think I was going to have a child, so I was very concerned with giving her the best upbringing as possible. And in many ways, on reflection, I can see that the father is a projection of the kind of parent that I might have become when I was hitting rock bottom with my alcohol addiction. He's quite neglectful, but he's well-meaning, but he's a complete disaster. And the mother is more like the parent that I would have become when I was a sort of London girl about town, working for magazines, a bit pretentious, a bit narcissistic in my 20s. So I think I was figuring out the kind of parent that I wanted to be and the kind of parent that I didn't want to be in the pages of the novel. And that's how it came out in the sliding doors timeline.
Were you actively looking for an idea for a novel? Have you published 4 non-fiction books and you thought, now's probably a good time that I have a stab at fiction? Were you actively seeking for this idea, or was it a touch more organic that it presented itself that way?
A couple of years previous to me writing the first draft, I had been approached by a fiction publisher who said that they wanted me to write a novel and they wanted to give me a deal. And that was who ultimately gave me the deal. So I had always been thinking about it in a non-conscious way. And then when this came about, she was such a strong character, and I loved the duality of the 2 timelines and how you can play around with that. And, the fact that it's a bit of a butterfly effect of how, like the father, different things happen to him in the 2 different timelines. And I don't want to give too much away, but there's also a murder mystery that plays out in both of the timelines in different ways. So that really captures my imagination. And as soon as I had that idea, I knew that I had to write it, and it just started pushing its way out of me. So I went with it. But before that, I had a couple of ideas, but I wasn't really feeling them. And I think if you have an idea and you don't have to write it, that isn't the idea. You have to write it.
Let's talk about so it's nature versus nurture. It's also for you plotting versus pantsing, really. So I cannot get my head around this idea that you say you're a plotter, but the kind of the story is growing organically around you. So when you first sit down to write, the very first sentence and scene, which is Fern heading to accidentally nick a car, which is something you did not do. What do you know about the whole trajectory of the story?
Okay, so I knew everything that was going to happen. I had plotted it all out, but the way that I pantsed it is, as I was writing it, some things felt wrong. So as I got to know the characters better, and I've heard so many novelists say things like this on your podcast, where they say things like, you give birth to the characters and then they start walking around and saying things and doing things and you just observe. And I thought, that can't be right. But I now see what they mean, because there were times when I was like, actually, Scout would never do this, so I need to change this plot point. Or the person who killed Fern's uncle completely changed by the end of the story because the nuance of it changed as I wrote it. So I do think that it's important to give yourself the flexibility to change around the characters, because once they do make themselves known, they might not do the things that you wanted them to do.
Let's just talk about the characterization of the mum and the dad. So, as you said, Fern's mother, I'll read off the blurb. A social climber, former ballet dancer who lives a plush life in a London townhouse. Fern's father only climbs if there's a bottle at the top, which is a very good line. Has an IQ of 133 and lives hand-to-mouth in Californian motels. Now, I understand that those are very distilled one-line pitches for these 2 characters, but something like that in the nature of the story, those characters could become rather, I guess, stereotyped. The drunk dad, the very posh mum. How on earth did they manage to get together to make a child? How has that happened? What were you doing to make sure they weren't really 2-dimensional, very, very see-through stock characters?
Well, in the first draft, I think they were quite 2-dimensional because, as I say, I didn't put enough of myself into them. It was only once I really dug down and found the darkest parts of myself and also the brightest spots, because there's a lot of good in both of them, and they're not exclusively dark characters. They do have bright spots that they did start coming to life. So yeah, I don't think that you can't do it. I mean, there is one subhuman character in there that I did not put any of myself into, but I think if it's a main character, then you have to find some part of yourself and put it on the page.
You mentioned getting all those drafts done and really learning how to make yourself better and be quite strict over what it is that you are doing. How at what point did you realise that, oh, you might be getting somewhere? This is quite away from that very first draft that really didn't go anywhere for you.
I mean, the first draft had its place. Most of the storylines stayed the same from the first draft, but it was when I really felt proud of the work and very satisfied with it. But also, any professional author, you have an end date. Like, there's a point where you have to stop tinkering and you just get it to the best possible place that you can. I mean, I was in a good position where I could ask my editor towards the end of my deadline. She said, this is good to go. This is good to go to press. And I said, I don't feel like it is. I feel like I can do better. I want to scrap 40,000 words and spend 3 months rewriting those. And she was a bit nervous about that. But once I did it, she could see why, because it was vastly improved by that. I don't know how to describe it. There's just like a click that happens, but also the deadline comes and there's no more you can do. And you've pushed it as far as you can. And that's just the end of it. And that's why often when the book has gone to print, I won't really reread it because I'll be constantly editing it and wanting to improve it even more. So, yeah, at some point you have to stop tinkering.
Well, here's the deal. Like, you found writing this first novel quite tricky because of the reasons that you've outlined. You're very excited about your second one. Many people say that, well, the second novel is almost harder. How are you prepared to have to learn loads more writing this next one?
That's such a good question. I don't know, because I feel like I've rinsed the world of resources. I literally found everything I could, apart from some random Dean Koontz book on how to write a novel that was about £100 on eBay. So, I mean, I'm just going to have to find what I can. I'm going to have to go deep on the podcast, like listen to your last 30 podcasts that I haven't listened to. But I do feel like now, because I did redraft so significantly, that I have written more like 3 novels. And so hopefully it will be a smoother process. And, you know, I do have these little rules now that I won't break, like, for instance, taking back my metaphors. And I don't know whether you've heard this from other writers. So a lot of people want to, when they say that a character says something, they want to say so-and-so exclaimed. No, I don't do that anymore. I just say that they said it. The only one that I will allow myself is whispered. And I've noticed that other writers tend to give themselves one alternative, whether it's murmured or shouted. It's almost like you need one that's not said or asks. So there's all of those sort of basics that I now have. They're now innate. And I can also see it in other people's work. I almost edit that, not in a cruel way in any way. It's just more that, you know, this would have been better if they'd just taken off this final line. But also I'm so inspired by other novelists. I read their work and I'm like, wow, how did they do that? I want to be able to do something like that. So it's just that constant, learning mindset. And I really hope it's not harder than the first novel, Dan, because the first was so hard. I don't know. I have a feeling it won't be, but maybe I'm naive.
That's it then. Thank you so much for watching a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. It's the podcast where we take a look through an author's working day with Katherine Gray. That brand new novel is Versions of a Girl, and you can pick it up right now. If you enjoyed this and you want to hear from more of the greatest authors around, all about how they get to work, then make sure you follow my Writer's Routine podcast. Search for it wherever you get your shows. There are over 300 episodes there for you. And subscribe right here on YouTube for loads more daily rituals. I've been Dan Simpson. We will be back really soon. Thank you for watching.